The hum of the restaurant was a dull roar in Cassie's ears, a messy mix of clattering plates, chatting strangers, and the thumping beat of some pop song she didn't recognize. But all of it was just background noise to the real sound that was drilling into her brain, the sound of her Uncle Frank's voice. Again. He was leaning across the table, his fork waving a piece of chicken around for emphasis, his face a mask of what he probably thought was kindly concern but which felt to Cassie a lot like being poked with a sharp stick. Over and over. "And I just worry, you know?" Frank said, shaking his head. The overhead light gleamed off his bald spot. "A pretty girl like you all alone in that little apartment. Your cousin Sheila, now she's been married, what, 3 years? 2 kids. A real family woman. You're not getting any younger, Cassie. The good ones, they get snatched up. You don't want to end up alone, do you?" Cassie forced a smile. It felt tight and thin on her face like a rubber band stretched too far. She looked down at her own plate, pushing a piece of broccoli around in a circle with her fork. She had just gotten a promotion at her job at the library, a real one with more responsibility and a better title. She'd been so proud to tell everyone. But all Uncle Frank wanted to talk about was her non-existent love life. It was like her actual accomplishments were invisible. "I'm fine, Uncle Frank," she said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "Really? I've been busy with work." "Work, schmirk," he scoffed, finally eating the chicken off his fork. "A job won't keep you warm at night. Won't give you grandchildren for your mother." He winked at Cassie's mom, who just gave a weak, fluttering smile and looked down at her napkin. She never knew what to say when Frank started up like this. Cassie felt a hot, prickly feeling crawl up the back of her neck. She was 27. She had her own place, she paid her own bills, she had a best friend she adored, and a cat who tolerated her. She wasn't some lonely, sad character in a movie. But sitting at this table, under the bright, unforgiving lights of the family restaurant, with Uncle Frank's words hanging in the air between them, that's exactly how she felt. Small. And a little bit broken. The rest of the dinner was a blur of more questions, more hints, more stories about Sheila's perfect husband and their perfect kids. Cassie answered in monosyllables, counting down the minutes until she could politely make her escape. When the bill finally came, she practically threw her share of the cash onto the table, mumbled her goodbyes and all but ran out into the cool evening air. The drive home was quiet. The happy, confident feeling she'd had before dinner was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, annoyed ache in her chest. Why did it bother her so much? Why did his opinion even matter? But it did. It always did. It was like he had a special talent for finding the one thing she was secretly insecure about and poking at it until it bruised. She unlocked the door to her apartment, greeted by the welcoming purr of her tabby cat, whiskers weaving figure eights around her ankles. She scooped him up, burying her face in his soft fur for a second. "At least you're happy to see me, buddy," she whispered. But the comfort was fleeting. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, and Uncle Frank's voice seemed to echo in it. All alone. Her phone buzzed. It was Maya. The screen lit up with a picture of her best friend making a silly face. Cassie answered, putting it on speakerphone as she dropped onto her couch. "So, how was the dinner of doom?" Maya's voice was bright and cheerful, a direct contrast to the gloom in Cassie's living room. "The worst," Cassie groaned, flopping onto her back and staring at the ceiling. "It was the worst one yet. Uncle Frank's new mission in life is to make me feel like a lonely old spinster who will die alone and be eaten by her cats." "Dramatic," Maya said, but her tone was sympathetic. "He's a troll. Ignore him." "I can't. He gets in my head. And my mom just sits there. She never tells him to stop." Cassie sighed, a long, heavy sound. "He's already talking about the big summer barbecue next month. It's going to be a whole new level of interrogation. I can't face it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Cassie could almost hear the gears turning in Maya's head. "So," Maya said slowly, a familiar, mischievous note entering her voice. "Don't face it alone." "What, are you going to come and pretend to be my girlfriend?" Cassie joked, though it fell flat. "Better," Maya said, her words coming faster now, fueled by the brilliance of a truly terrible idea. "Hire one." Cassie sat up. "Hire a what?" "A boyfriend. A fake one. For the barbecue. You hire some guy to show up, be all charming and boyfriend-wife for a few hours, make Uncle Frank eat his words, and then he leaves. Poof. Problem solved." Cassie blinked. "Maya, that's the most insane thing I've ever heard. You can't just hire a boyfriend. That's not a real thing." "It is totally a real thing." Maya insisted. "There are websites for it. For events and stuff. You know, people who need a +1 for a wedding, things like that." It's just acting. We find a guy, we pay him, he shows up, he acts devoted, you look like a rock star who has a super hot, mysterious boyfriend, and Uncle Frank shuts his big mouth for once. It's genius. Cassie's first instinct was to say no. It was ridiculous. It was desperate. It was a lie. But then she pictured it. Pictured walking into the backyard barbecue with a tall, handsome man on her arm. Pictured Uncle Frank's jaw dropping. Pictured being able to enjoy a burger without a 20-question survey about her dating apps. The idea, crazy as it was, started to form a tiny, glowing ember of hope in her chest. It's silly, Cassie whispered, but the protest was weak. It's brilliant, Maya corrected. Come on. Let's just look. What's the harm in looking? Against her better judgment, Cassie found herself opening her laptop. Whiskers jumped onto the couch beside her, purring loudly as if giving his approval. Maya talked her through it, and sure enough, after a few searches they found a site. It looked surprisingly professional. Profiles of men, all with stage names listing their heights, builds, and services. Arm candy, intellectual stimulation, the tough guy. See? Maya said triumphantly. It's a thing. Okay, filter for tall. Definitely tall. And tough guy. You need someone who looks like he could silence Uncle Frank with a look. Cassie scrolled, her heart beating a little faster. It felt weird, like online shopping for a person. Then she stopped. One profile had no face picture, just a shadowy silhouette against a dark background. The username was simply Rafe. His bio was short, no nonsense. Discreet. Professional. Convincing. Can handle any situation. Ideal for deterring unwanted family attention. Him, Maya said immediately. He sounds perfect. Mysterious. Can handle any situation. That's exactly what you need. Someone who can handle Uncle Frank. Cassie read the words again. Discreet. Professional. It didn't sound romantic or creepy. It sounded safe. Like hiring a bodyguard instead of a boyfriend. The tiny ember of hope glowed a little brighter. Maybe, just maybe. Her finger hovered over the book now button. This was crazy. This was the kind of thing that happened in those silly romance novels she sometimes read, not in real life. But the memory of Uncle Frank's smug face flashed in her mind. She clicked the button. A form popped up. Date, time, location. She filled it out, her hands feeling slightly clammy. It asked for special instructions. She typed, family barbecue. Need to impress / quiet a nosy uncle. Just need you to be polite and stick by my side for a few hours. She entered her payment information, her stomach doing a nervous flip. It was done. She had just hired a fake boyfriend. I did it, she said into the phone, her voice a mix of terror and excitement. Maya whooped. Yes. Operation, Shut Up Frank is a go. This is going to be amazing. Cassie ended the call and stared at her computer screen, at the confirmation email that now sat in her inbox. Booking confirmed for Rafe. She had just committed to an elaborate, ridiculous lie. A part of her felt deeply foolish. But a bigger part, the part that was tired of feeling small, felt a thrill of defiant anticipation. For the first time all night, Uncle Frank's voice was gone from her head, replaced by a single nervous but hopeful thought. What have I just done? The week between booking the fake boyfriend and the day of the barbecue stretched and warped for Cassie, each day moving with the sluggish, nerve-wracking pace of a nightmare on the verge of tipping into a wonderful dream, or perhaps a terrible one. She oscillated wildly between giddy excitement and cold, clammy regret. One moment she was picturing the stunned, approving look on her mother's face, the next she was imagining the entire horrible charade collapsing in a heap of exposed lies and humiliating laughter. She must have reread Rafe's sparse profile 100 times, searching for hidden meaning in those few clipped words. Discreet. Professional. Convincing. What did that really mean? Was he an actor? Security guard? A weirdo? The lack of a photo was the most terrifying part. He could be anyone. Maya, of course, was relentlessly optimistic. He's going to be gorgeous, she declared over the phone the night before the event. The no-photo thing is a marketing tactic. It builds mystery. He's probably a model who does this for extra cash. You'll see. He'll show up looking like he just walked off a movie set. Cassie wished she could borrow even a fraction of Maya's confidence. Instead, she spent the morning of the barbecue cleaning her already clean apartment with a frantic, nervous energy that left Whiskers hiding under the bed. She tried on 3 different outfits, each one feeling somehow wrong. Too try-hard? Too casual? Was she supposed to dress like she was on a date with her own fake boyfriend? The entire premise was absurd. Finally, she settled on a simple sundress, a pale yellow that she usually felt happy in. She told herself it was for her own benefit, a small piece of armor against the day. The party was at her parents' house, but Rafe was instructed to come to her apartment first so they could get their story straight. A story they hadn't actually invented yet. Another wave of nausea hit her. What were they going to talk about? How did they meet? How long had they been dating? She hadn't planned any of it. This was a disaster. The appointed time was 2 p.m. At 1:58 p.m., the atmosphere in her living room was so thick with anxiety you could almost see it. Cassie stood in the middle of the room, wringing her hands, running through a dozen worst-case scenarios. He wouldn't show up. He'd show up and be wildly inappropriate. He'd show up and be 70 years old. The doorbell rang, a sharp, cheerful sound that made her jump nearly out of her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. Point of no return. She walked to the door, her legs feeling like they were made of wood, and pulled it open. And the world just stopped. The man standing on her welcome mat was not what she had expected. He wasn't just handsome. That word felt too simple, too weak for what he was. He was immense. He seemed to fill the entire doorway, his broad shoulders blocking out the sunlight from the hallway window. He was easily a foot taller than her, and he was all solid, muscular strength packed into a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans. His hair was thick and dark, cut short but just long enough to look a little untamed. And his eyes were the most startling shade of pale, stormy gray she had ever seen. They weren't just looking at her. They were studying her, scanning her face with an intensity that felt less like a first meeting and more like an appraisal. He wasn't smiling. His expression was neutral, serious, almost severe. Cassie's carefully rehearsed greeting, "Hello, you must be Rafe?" died in her throat. All she could manage was a small, unintelligent squeak. "Cassie," he said. His voice was the thing that broke the spell. It wasn't a question, it was a low, rumbling statement, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep in her chest. It was a voice that didn't need to be loud to command absolute attention. "Why, yes," she stammered, finally finding her own voice, which sounded terribly thin and reedy next to his. "That's me. Come in. Please." She stepped back, holding the door open wider, feeling suddenly very small and very fragile in her sunny yellow dress. He moved inside, and the space of her apartment seemed to shrink around him. He didn't swagger or pose. His movement was all contained, efficient power, like a predator at rest. He glanced around the room, his gaze flicking over her bookshelves, her couch, her cat, who had emerged from hiding and was now staring at the stranger with wide, unblinking eyes, and then back to her. He didn't sit. "I appreciate you being on time," Cassie said, falling back on politeness to fill the deafening silence. "Punctuality is important," he replied, his tone flat and professional. There was no warmth in it, but no hostility either. It was like talking to a very focused, very large doctor. Or a soldier. "You outline the event. A family gathering. The primary objective is to deter a specific individual from his line of questioning. Correct?" Cassie blinked. Yes. My Uncle Frank. He's just really nosy. And he makes me feel small. I just want him to stop." She hadn't meant to add that last part, the vulnerable truth of it, but those steady gray eyes seemed to pull it out of her. Rafe gave a single short nod. "Understood. The objective is to project a unified front. Confidence. I will remain close. Handle the interactions. You will not feel small today." He said it with such absolute certainty, such concrete finality, that a strange sense of calm began to wash over Cassie's nerves. This wasn't a silly game anymore. This man was approaching it like a mission. And he looked very, very capable of completing his mission. "Okay," she said, breathing a little easier. "Okay, good. Should we, figure out our story? How we met? That kind of thing?" "The less elaborate the lie, the easier it is to maintain," he stated. "We met through mutual friends. We've been seeing each other for a month. We enjoy quiet evenings. The details are irrelevant and will only trip us up. If pressed, I will handle it." Cassie just nodded. It was a good plan. A simple plan. Mutual friends. A month. Quiet evenings. Got it. She looked him up and down again. "You're very good at this." "It's what you paid for," he said, and for the first time she saw the very faintest hint of something in his eyes. Not a smile but a flicker of something. Amusement? Acknowledgement? It was gone before she could identify it. "Right. Well, we should probably go. It's a short drive." She grabbed her purse and her keys, her hands only shaking a little. As she locked her apartment door behind them, She was hyper-aware of his presence just behind her, a wall of silent, watchful strength. He didn't touch her, but he walked close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The drive to her parents' house was quiet. Rafe sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the passing streets. He didn't try to make small talk. He didn't fiddle with the radio. He just existed, his quietness somehow filling the entire car. Cassie found herself sneaking glances at him. His profile was sharp and strong, his jaw set. He seemed completely unfazed, while her own heart was starting to pick up its pace again as they turned onto her parents' street. The house came into view and the backyard was already full of people. She could hear the murmur of voices and the smell of charcoal from the grill. She pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, taking a deep breath. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Showtime." Rafe turned his head to look at her fully. His intense gaze held hers for a long moment. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low. "Let me lead. It will be fine." He got out of the car and came around to her side before she could even unbuckle her seatbelt. He opened her door for her, a small, old-fashioned gesture that felt surprisingly natural coming from him. As she stood, he offered her his arm. It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. Cassie hesitated for only a second before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. His arm was solid as rock beneath her fingers. Together they walked around the side of the house and into the backyard. The effect was instantaneous. The chatter didn't exactly die, but it certainly hushed. Dozens of eyes turned toward them. Cassie saw her mother look up from the salad bowl, her eyes going wide with surprise. She saw her father pause mid-burger flip, his eyebrows raising. And she saw Uncle Frank, holding a soda, his mouth actually hanging slightly open as he took in the sight of his niece attached to the arm of a man who looked like he could bench press a car. Rafe didn't stiffen or preen under the attention. He simply leaned down, his head dipping close to Cassie's ear, his voice a warm, private rumble that only she could hear. "Remember," he murmured, his breath brushing her skin and sending an entirely unexpected shiver down her spine. "You are not alone." And in that moment, standing in her parents' backyard with a stranger's arm solidly under her hand and his words in her ear, Cassie realized something astonishing. For the first time at one of these parties, she truly believed it. The backyard barbecue, which for years had been a source of low-grade dread for Cassie, transformed into something entirely new, something she could only describe as a surreal and fascinating play. And Rafe was the star actor, delivering a performance so utterly convincing that Cassie, the person who had hired him, found herself occasionally forgetting it was all a performance. He never left her side. His presence was a constant, warm and solid anchor in the chattering sea of her relatives. He didn't need to be overly affectionate. His act was one of quiet, possessive proximity. A hand resting lightly on the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd. Standing just a little too close, his arm brushing against hers whenever they stopped to talk to someone. Fetching her a drink without being asked and handing it to her with a nod, his fingers briefly grazing hers. Each small, calculated touch sent a jolt through her system, a confusing mix of pretend and a very real fizzy sensation that was entirely unexpected. Uncle Frank, of course, made a beeline for them almost immediately, a look of blatant curiosity on his face. Well, Cassie, aren't you going to introduce us to your friend?" he said, his voice booming with false cheer. Cassie opened her mouth, but Rafe spoke first, his voice that same calm, low rumble. "Rafe," he said, extending a hand. His grip, Cassie noticed, made Frank's meaty hand look almost delicate. Frank's smile tightened slightly. "Frank, Cassie's uncle. So Rafe, what is it you do?" Frank launched into his interrogation, but Rafe deflected each question with an effortless, polite vagueness that was a masterclass in evasion. "I'm in security," Rafe said, which was technically true, Cassie supposed, in the most broad sense imaginable. "How did you two meet?" Frank pressed. "Through a mutual friend," Rafe replied, his gray eyes steady. He didn't elaborate. "And how long has this been going on?" "Long enough to know I'm a lucky man," Rafe said, and then he did something that made Cassie's breath catch. He looked down at her, and for the benefit of their audience, a slow, small smile touched his lips. It wasn't a big, flashy grin. It was something more intimate, more genuine looking. It completely transformed his severe face, carving a faint dimple in his cheek and making the stormy gray of his eyes soften just a fraction. Cassie's heart did a funny little flip-flop in her chest. The man was a professional, she reminded herself fiercely. This was all part of the job. But it was working. Frank, frustrated by the lack of concrete details but visibly disarmed by Rafe's imposing presence and that surprisingly effective smile, eventually mumbled something about checking on the burgers and wandered away. Cassie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "See," Rafe murmured, his head dipping close to hers again. The low vibration of his voice was becoming a familiar, strangely comforting sensation. "He has nothing to latch onto. No ammunition." "You're amazing at this," Cassie whispered back, her cheeks feeling warm. "I told you," he said simply. "It's what you paid for." The afternoon wore on. Rafe was quiet but polite with her parents, answering her mother's flustered questions about whether he wanted more potato salad with a "No, thank you, ma'am." "It's excellent, though," that made her mother blush with pleasure. He helped her father move a heavy cooler without being asked, lifting it as if it weighed nothing, earning a nod of gruff approval. He was seamlessly weaving himself into the fabric of the day, becoming less of a strange guest and more of a natural, if silent, part of the scenery. And Cassie, for the first time, was actually enjoying herself. The constant, low-grade anxiety that usually hummed under her skin at these events was gone, replaced by a strange, giddy confidence. She laughed more easily. She didn't nervously scan the room for Uncle Frank. She felt protected. It was a dangerous feeling to have about a man you'd hired off the internet, but in the golden afternoon light, with his solid shoulder brushing against hers, it felt entirely real. It was as they were finishing dessert, the sky beginning to paint itself in streaks of orange and purple, that the first change happened. Rafe, who had been leaning against the fence post beside her, suddenly went perfectly still. His affable, neutral expression vanished, replaced by an alertness that was almost animalistic. His head tilted slightly as if he were listening to a sound no one else could hear. His gaze sharpened, scanning the horizon, his nostrils flaring just a little. "Everything okay?" Cassie asked, following his gaze but seeing nothing but the darkening trees at the edge of her parents' property. He blinked and the intense look was gone, shuddered away. "The wind is shifting," he said, his voice flat. "A storm is coming. A big one." Cassie looked up at the nearly cloudless sky. "Are you sure?" The forecast said clear skies. "I'm sure," he said, and there was a finality in his tone that brooked no argument. "We should leave. Soon." Almost as if on his command, the first gust of wind kicked up, whipping paper plates off the table and sending napkins dancing across the lawn. Within minutes, the sky began to bruise, dark clouds rolling in with an unnatural speed. The temperature dropped sharply. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and her relatives began scrambling to gather their things, the party breaking up in a chaotic rush. "Told you," Rafe said, his hand once again on her back, urging her toward the house to say her goodbyes. By the time they reached Cassie's car, the first heavy drops of rain were beginning to fall, splattering loudly on the windshield. The drive back to her apartment was a tense, silent affair. The wind howled around the car, shaking it on its wheels. Lightning forks split the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that seemed to shake the very world. The peaceful afternoon felt like a distant memory, replaced by a primal, violent energy. Rafe sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his knuckles white where he gripped his knees. He seemed coiled, every muscle tense, his eyes fixed on the storm raging outside as if it were a personal enemy. They pulled into her apartment parking lot just as the heavens truly opened, the rain coming down not in drops but in a solid, drenching sheet. The power in the building was out, no lights shone in the windows. "You can't drive in this." Cassie yelled over the roar of the storm as they made a mad, soaking dash for her front door. "It's not safe. You'll have to wait it out." He just gave a sharp, jerky nod, water streaming from his hair and down his face. He looked pained, agitated in a way that went far beyond a dislike of bad weather. Once inside her dark apartment, dripping onto the welcome mat, the reality of the situation descended upon Cassie. She was alone in her pitch-black apartment with a man she barely knew. The professional, mission-oriented facade of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by a strange, crackling tension. The only light came from the frequent flashes of lightning, illuminating the room in brief, stark bursts. "I'll get you a towel," Cassie said, her voice echoing in the strange quiet of the powerless apartment. She felt her way down the hallway to the linen closet, her heart pounding from the run through the rain. When she returned, holding out a large, fluffy towel, Rafe was standing exactly where she'd left him, but his head was bowed, his shoulders hunched. He was breathing deeply as if trying to calm himself. "Thank you," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He took the towel but didn't use it. He just held it, clenched in his fists. A particularly close bolt of lightning struck nearby, followed instantly by a thunderclap so loud it vibrated through the floorboards. Rafe flinched violently, a low guttural sound escaping his throat that was utterly unlike anything Cassie had ever heard from a human. It was a raw, pained noise. "Are you okay?" she asked, taking a hesitant step forward. "Fine," he gritted out, the words strained. I should go. I shouldn't be here." "Don't be ridiculous," Cassie said, a surge of protectiveness washing over her. "You're staying on the couch. It's not a problem. Really." She gestured toward the living room. "Just try to get some sleep. It'll pass." He didn't argue further, just gave another one of those tight, jerky nods and moved like a ghost into her living room, collapsing onto the couch and putting his head in his hands. He looked like a man fighting a terrible internal battle. Cassie retreated to her bedroom, leaving her door open a crack. She changed into dry pajamas, her mind racing. His behavior was so strange, so intense. It was more than just not liking storms. It was a visceral, physical reaction. She lay in her bed, listening to the storm rage outside and the unnerving silence from her living room. Sleep was impossible. Hours later, the storm had finally dwindled to a soft, steady rain. The tension in the apartment, however, had not eased. A thirst born of nerves drove Cassie from her bed. She crept out into the dark hallway, heading for the kitchen. As she passed the living room, she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. It was a low, rumbling growl. It was deep and primal, a sound that belonged in a deep forest, not in her cozy apartment. It was followed by a soft, ragged sigh. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear, cold and sharp, prickled at her skin. Slowly, silently, she peeked around the doorframe. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint, gray pre-dawn light filtering through the windows. Rafe was asleep on the couch, one arm thrown over his face. He seemed restless, his body twitching. And then, as Cassie watched, frozen in place, he shifted in his sleep. A flash of distant lightning, the last gasp of the storm, lit up the room for a split second. And in that fleeting moment of illumination, Cassie saw it. His eyes, just visible under his arm, were open. And they were no longer the stormy gray she knew. They glowed with a faint, unmistakable wolf-like gold. She jerked back, pressing herself against the wall in the hallway, her hand clamped over her mouth to stop a scream. Her heart was hammering so hard she felt dizzy. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. A weird reflection from the lightning. She was tired, stressed, her imagination was running wild. She repeated it to herself like a mantra. Trick of the light. Imagination. Not real. But as she stood there trembling in the dark, the low, soft growl came again from the living room, a sound that vibrated through the silence and felt as real as the floor beneath her feet. And for the first time the thought occurred to her, ridiculous and terrifying. What exactly had she hired? The rest of the night was a long, slow crawl through a tunnel of quiet terror. Cassie did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, her back ramrod straight, every muscle tense to listen. The rain softened to a gentle patter, then ceased altogether, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more ominous than the storm's fury. The only sounds were the normal creaks and sighs of her old apartment building, each one magnified by her fear into a potential threat. And from the living room there was nothing. No more growls. No movement. Just a profound, watchful silence that felt even more unsettling. Her mind raced in frantic, dizzying circles. The glowing eyes. The animalistic growl. It replayed over and over behind her eyelids every time she blinked. She tried to logic it away. A trick of the lightning. A sleep disorder. A particularly vivid and shared hallucination brought on by stress and a dramatic day. But the cold, primal fear coiling in her stomach refused to be reasoned with. It whispered one single insane word: wolf. When the first weak rays of dawn finally began to lighten the sky from black to a soft, bruised gray, Cassie felt a small measure of courage return with the light. The rational world was reasserting itself. She had to face him. She had to know. She crept to her bedroom door and listened. Still nothing. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she straightened her pajamas and walked with what she hoped was a normal gait into the hallway. The living room was empty. The couch where Rafe had been sleeping was vacant. The blanket she'd left out for him was folded into a neat, precise square on one cushion. For a wild, heart-lifting moment she thought he had simply left. The relief was so potent it made her knees weak. It was over. He was gone. She could just pretend the whole weird night never happened. And then she heard the faint clink of a dish from her small kitchen. Her heart plummeted back into her shoes. She moved slowly, drawn by a morbid curiosity that overpowered her fear. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. Rafe was there. He was standing at her counter, his back to her, pouring water from the kettle into 2 mugs. He was dressed again in the clothes from yesterday, which looked remarkably dry and unwrinkled. The kitchen was filled with the rich, comforting scent of brewing coffee. He moved with the same quiet efficiency he had shown at the barbecue, but the intense, pained energy from the night before was gone. He was just a large, quiet man making coffee in her kitchen at dawn. The normalcy of the scene was utterly disorienting. He must have sensed her presence because he paused and half-turned. His face was its usual neutral mask, the severe lines and angles softened slightly by the morning light. His eyes were their normal stormy gray. There was no trace of gold, no sign of the animal she thought she had seen. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fit perfectly with the quiet of the morning. Cassie could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. She watched him as he finished preparing the 2 mugs, adding a splash of milk to one. How did he know she took milk? And handing it to her. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and a jolt, entirely different from the fear of the night before, shot up her arm. It was a simple human connection. He was real. He was solid. And he was making her coffee. "I owe you an apology," he said, not looking at her, instead staring into his own black coffee. "My behavior last night was unprofessional. The storm. It affects me." The statement was so simple, so stark, and so utterly inadequate to explain what she had witnessed. But the apology, the acknowledgement that something had happened, cracked the shell of her fear. He wasn't pretending the strange events hadn't occurred. He was addressing them, however vaguely. "It's okay," she heard herself say, her voice barely a whisper. She took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. It was a bad storm. He finally looked at her, and his gaze was different. The professional detachment was still there, but it was layered with something else. A weariness. A hint of what looked like shame. "The job is concluded," he stated formally. "I should go." The word should have been a relief. This was the defined end of their transaction. He would walk out the door, and her life would return to its normal, predictable rhythm. But the thought filled her with a sudden, surprising sense of loss. The memory of him standing up to Uncle Frank, of his solid presence at her side, of that private, almost smile, it all rushed back. He had given her the best family gathering she'd ever had. And now he was just going to leave and she'd never see him again. "You don't have to," she blurted out, the words surprising her as much as they seemed to surprise him. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "I mean, you made me coffee. The least I can do is make you breakfast. To say thank you. For yesterday. It worked. Better than I could have imagined." She was babbling. She forced herself to stop, her face growing warm. She expected him to refuse, to give that short, sharp nod and see himself out. Instead, he studied her for a long, silent moment. His intense gaze felt different in the soft morning light. It felt less like an appraisal and more like a search. He was looking for something in her face. Sincerity, perhaps. Or a trap. "All right," he said finally, the word a quiet concession. Breakfast. What followed was one of the most strangely comfortable mornings of Cassie's life. She made eggs and toast, and they ate at her small kitchen table. The awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, curious peace. He asked her about her job at the library, and she found herself talking animatedly about her favorite authors and the challenges of organizing the annual book sale. He listened, really listened, his full attention on her in a way that was both unnerving and incredibly flattering. She, in turn, asked him about his work. He was more open than he had been with Uncle Frank. He talked about security consulting, about assessing risks and managing unpredictable situations. He spoke about the woods, about the feeling of solitude among tall trees, with a reverence that was palpable. It was still vague, but it felt real. It felt like him. He didn't mention the storm. She didn't mention the glowing eyes. They existed in an unspoken truce, a silent agreement to live in the rational, sunlit present. When they were done eating, he helped her wash the dishes. They stood side by side at her sink, him washing, her drying. It was such a normal domestic act, and yet being this close to him in the quiet intimacy of her kitchen, felt anything but normal. She was hyper-aware of the sheer size of him, the way his presence seemed to dominate the space. She could smell the clean, earthy scent of him, something like pine and autumn air. The fake date was over. The transaction was complete. But something new was here in this quiet kitchen. Something real and unplanned and terrifyingly intriguing. Finally, the dishes were done. The reason for him to stay was gone. He dried his hands on the towel and turned to face her. "I should go now," he said again, but this time his voice was softer, lacking its earlier finality. "Okay," Cassie said, her heart doing that funny flip-flop again. She walked him to the door, the distance feeling much shorter than it had the day before. He paused with his hand on the doorknob and turned back to her. The morning light from the door's window pane fell across his face. "The offer you made," he began, his voice a low, serious rumble. "Breakfast. To say thank you." He paused as if choosing his words with great care. "It was appreciated. But it doesn't settle the debt. I still owe you for your hospitality last night." Cassie's breath caught. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," he insisted, his gray eyes holding hers. The intensity was back, but it was a different kind. It wasn't professional. It was personal. "So, I would like to take you to dinner. A real one. No pretending." The world narrowed to the space between them in her doorway. The sounds of the waking city outside faded away. He wasn't Rafe the hired actor anymore. He was just Rafe. A complicated, mysterious, intensely compelling man who had seen her vulnerability and hadn't exploited it, who had fought some private demon in her living room, and who was now asking her out on a real date. All the fear and confusion of the night before melted away, burned up by the simple, shocking warmth of his request. A real smile, the first genuine one she'd felt all morning, spread across her face. "Yes," she said, the word coming out on a breath of relief and excitement. "I'd like that." A corner of his mouth lifted. It wasn't the full, practiced smile from the barbecue. It was smaller, shyer, and infinitely more real. "Good," he said. Then he opened the door and was gone. Cassie stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, the ghost of his almost smile etched in her mind. The fear was gone, replaced by a buzzing, hopeful anticipation. She had no idea what was happening. But for the first time in a long time, she couldn't wait to find out. The days between Rafe's departure from her apartment and their agreed-upon dinner date were the longest of Cassie's life. Time, which had raced forward in a blur of anxiety before the barbecue, now slowed to a maddening, syrupy crawl. Every hour felt like a year. She went to work, she shelved books, she helped patrons, she ate lunch with Maya and recounted the entire surreal story, leaving out the part about the glowing eyes, which even to her own ears sounded insane. She tried to immerse herself in the normal, predictable rhythm of her life, but it was like trying to read a familiar book while someone played a thrilling, unknown symphony just outside the window. Her mind was elsewhere. Was with him. Maya, of course, was ecstatic. "A real date. I told you. I told you he was into you. You hired a fake boyfriend and landed a real one who looks like, well, like that. This is the best story I have ever heard in my entire life." Cassie had to shush her repeatedly in the quiet of the library break room. But beneath the giddy excitement, a low thrum of nervousness persisted. The memory of that stormy night was a ghost in the corner of her mind, a faint, unsettling chill that the bright sunshine of the afternoon barbecue couldn't completely dispel. Who was he really? The question became a constant, whispering companion. The night of the date arrived. Cassie spent far too long deciding what to wear, finally settling on a simple dark green dress that made her eyes look brighter. She told herself it was just dinner. Thank you meal. But the fluttery feeling in her stomach felt a lot more significant than simple gratitude. He picked her up precisely on time. He wasn't in a car. He was just there, standing on her doorstep when she opened it, having arrived with a silence that was becoming familiar. He looked different. Still overwhelmingly large and intense, but softer. His dark jeans were clean, his button-down shirt was a deep blue that made his gray eyes seem even stormier, and it was open at the collar. He'd made an effort. The sight of him, standing there under the porch light, made her breath catch. "You look nice," he said, his voice that low, grounding rumble. The compliment was simple, delivered without flourish, and felt more genuine than any flowery line ever could. "So do you," she managed to reply, her voice only trembling a little. He didn't take her to a fancy, crowded restaurant downtown. He led her on a short walk to a small, family-owned Italian place tucked away on a side street she'd never noticed before. It was warm and cozy, filled with the incredible smell of garlic and baking bread, and quiet enough that they could actually talk. And they did talk. The conversation that had started over breakfast in her kitchen flowed easier here, over a checkered tablecloth and a flickering candle. The professional mask was gone. He asked her about her childhood, about her dreams of maybe one day writing a children's book. He listened with that same unnerving focus, his eyes never leaving her face. He spoke more about his own life, carefully skirting any details that felt too specific, but talking with a quiet passion about the mountains he loved, the feeling of a cold river, the importance of loyalty. He was still a mystery, but the mystery was becoming fascinating instead of frightening. Cassie found herself laughing, really laughing at a dry, witty observation he made about a noisy couple at another table. She saw him smile in return, a real, unguarded smile that lit up his whole face and made her feel inexplicably proud. The strange events of the stormy night felt like a dream from another lifetime. The warmth, the connection, the way his gaze made her feel seen and interesting, this felt real. All too soon the dinner was over. They declined dessert and he walked her home. The night air was cool and clear, a stark contrast to the violent storm of their last night together. They walked in a comfortable silence, their arms occasionally brushing. The world felt peaceful. They were 2 blocks from her apartment building when the feeling changed. Cassie felt it first as a prickle on the back of her neck, a primitive warning. She glanced over her shoulder. A man was walking on the other side of the street about half a block back. He was just a silhouette under the streetlights. There was no reason to be alarmed. But something felt off. She quickened her pace slightly. A moment later, she glanced back again. The man had crossed the street. He was now on their side and he was closer. His hands were shoved in his pockets and his head was down, but his pace had unmistakably matched theirs. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She looked at Rafe. He was still walking calmly beside her, but his posture had changed. The relaxed set of his shoulders was gone, replaced by a subtle, coiled tension. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. "Rafe," she whispered, her voice tight. "I know," he said, his voice low and utterly calm. "Don't look back. Keep walking. We're almost there." His calmness should have been reassuring, but it only heightened her fear. This was his security expertise kicking in. This was real. They turned the corner onto her street. Her apartment building was in sight, a beacon of safety just 100 yards away. The sound of footsteps behind them quickened. Heavy, purposeful steps, closing the distance. "Cassie," Rafe's voice was a soft, urgent command. "When I say so, I want you to run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Get inside and lock the door." "What are you going to do?" she gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Before he could answer, a low, rough voice called out from behind them. "Hey, I want to talk to you." Cassie froze. Rafe stopped walking and slowly turned around, placing his body squarely between her and the approaching man. She peeked around his arm. The man was big, with a mean-looking face and cold eyes. He looked nothing like the shadowy figure from before. He was real and he was dangerous. "You got a problem?" the man snarled, stopping a few feet away. "We don't want any trouble," Rafe said, his voice dangerously quiet. It was the same voice he'd used with Uncle Frank, but now it was stripped of all pretense of politeness. It was pure cold steel. "Too bad," the man said, and he started to reach into his jacket. What happened next was so fast Cassie's brain could barely process it. Rafe didn't shout. He didn't assume a fighting stance. He simply moved. It was a blur of motion. He pushed Cassie gently but firmly behind him, putting her fully out of the man's line of sight. And then from Rafe's throat came a sound. It wasn't a shout. It was a deep, guttural, bone-chilling growl. It was the same sound she'd heard from her living room couch, but now it was wide awake, focused, and full of lethal promise. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a predator claiming its territory, a warning that vibrated through the still night air. The effect on the other man was instantaneous. His bravado vanished, replaced by pure, primal terror. His eyes widened, the whites showing all around. The thing he was reaching for in his jacket was forgotten. He took a stumbling step backward, his face ashen. What are you?" the man stammered, his voice shaking. Rafe took one single, deliberate step forward. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the man, and even from behind him, Cassie could feel the terrifying intensity of that look. It was enough. The man turned and ran, his footsteps slapping desperately against the pavement as he fled back around the corner and into the night, disappearing as quickly as he had come. The silence that descended was absolute. Cassie stood, trembling, her hand pressed over her mouth. Rafe remained where he was, his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The terrifying energy that had radiated from him slowly receded, like a tide going out. Finally he turned around. His face was calm, but his eyes were blazing with a ferocious protectiveness that stole the breath from her lungs. He looked her over, his gaze scanning her for any sign of harm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice back to its normal rumble, though slightly rough around the edges. She could only nod, her words trapped in her throat. The fear was still there, a cold shock in her veins, but it was being rapidly overwhelmed by something else, awe and a dizzying, powerful attraction. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't ask permission. He simply pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. She could feel the solid, frantic beat of his heart against her cheek. He held her like he would never let go, like he was anchoring them both to the earth after the earthquake that had just shaken their world. "No one," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion that shook her to her core, "will ever hurt you. I won't allow it." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative first kiss. It was a claiming. It was fire and desperation and a raw, wild need that poured from him into her. It was a kiss that held the echo of his animalistic growl and the fierce promise of his words. It was a kiss that shattered the last of her doubts and sealed a truth she could no longer deny. Whatever he was, wherever he came from, what was growing between them was terrifying, unpredictable, and utterly, completely real. The world ceased to exist beyond the space where their lips met. Cassie was lost in a whirlwind of sensation, the shocking softness of his mouth against hers, the iron strength of his arms holding her, the faint, wild scent of pine and night air that clung to his skin. The fear from the confrontation melted away, burned to nothing by the sheer, overwhelming heat of the kiss. It was a kiss that felt like an answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask, a primal, perfect fit that made every cell in her body hum in recognition. When he finally broke away, they were both breathing raggedly. His forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed. The street was silent again, save for the frantic pounding of her own heart, which she was sure he must be able to hear. The look on his face was one of raw, stunned vulnerability, as if the kiss had shattered something inside him too. "Cassie," he breathed, her name a prayer and an apology on his lips. She couldn't speak. She could only look up at him, her mind reeling. The growl, the speed, the terrifying force of his presence that had made a dangerous man flee in pure animal terror, it all crashed down around the beautiful, searing memory of the kiss. The 2 things didn't fit together. They were pieces from different puzzles, and trying to force them to match was making her head spin. He seemed to see the confusion and dawning fear in her eyes. The vulnerability in his own face shuttered closed, replaced by a grim resolve. He gently took her elbow, his touch now infinitely careful. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "Let's get you inside." He didn't let go of her until her apartment door was closed and locked behind them. Whiskers meowed a greeting, weaving around their legs, oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred in his owner's universe. The normalcy of her home, with its cozy couch and shelves of books, felt like a bizarre stage set after the drama of the street. Cassie stood in the middle of the living room, wrapping her arms around herself. She felt cold despite the warmth of the apartment. Rafe stood by the door, watching her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with everything that was unsaid. Finally she found her voice. It came out small and shaky. "What was that, Rafe?" He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He knew exactly what she was asking. He looked down at the floor, a muscle working in his jaw. "I protected you," he said, the words simple and utterly inadequate. "That wasn't just protection," she insisted, a tremor of hysteria in her voice. "That sound you made, that man, he looked at you like you were a monster. And the other night, during the storm, your eyes." The words tumbled out, the secret fear she'd been clinging to finally breaking free. "I saw them. I thought I imagined it, but I didn't, did I? They glowed. What are you?" He flinched as if she'd struck him. He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the pain in his stormy eyes was so profound it made her want to take the question back. But she couldn't. She had to know. Her life, her reality depended on the answer. "You deserve the truth," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All of it. But you can't unhear it, Cassie. Once I tell you, your world changes forever. Are you sure you want that?" The choice was laid before her. She could tell him to leave. She could lock the door behind him and spend the rest of her life trying to convince herself it had all been a strange, stress-induced dream. She could return to her safe, predictable world of books and quiet routines. She looked at him. She saw the man who had stood up to Uncle Frank not with anger, but with quiet strength. The man who had listened to her talk about her dreams over dinner. The man who had just kissed her with a desperation that had felt like a lifeline. And she saw the man who had growled a sound that didn't belong to humanity. The safe world suddenly seemed incredibly lonely. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "I'm sure. Tell me." He took a deep, shuddering breath, as if steeling himself for a great pain. "We can't talk here," he said. "The walls have ears. We need to go somewhere private." Without another word, he turned and opened her apartment door, holding it open for her. It wasn't a request. It was a necessity. Numbly, Cassie followed him out. They didn't speak in the elevator or in the lobby. He led her to a powerful black motorcycle parked a block away, a machine that suited him perfectly. He handed her a helmet. "Trust me," he said, and the two words were laden with more meaning than any others he could have spoken. She put on the helmet and climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. The engine roared to life, and they sped through the sleeping city, the wind whipping past them. She held on tight, pressing her face against the solid warmth of his back, her mind a chaotic storm of fear and a stubborn, unshakable trust. They left the city lights behind, heading into the dark, tree-lined roads that led into the mountains. The air grew cooler and cleaner, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. After about 20 minutes, he turned onto a narrow, unpaved road that climbed steeply upward, finally stopping at a secluded lookout point. Below them, the city was a distant carpet of twinkling lights, silent and unaware. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the sigh of the wind in the tall trees. He got off the bike and helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment before he stepped back, giving her space. He walked to the edge of the lookout, his back to her, staring out at the vast darkness. Cassie waited, her heart thumping painfully against her ribs. "What you saw," he began, his voice quiet but clear in the mountain stillness, "wasn't a trick of the light. What you heard wasn't a human sound." He turned to face her, and his expression was one of ancient, weary truth. "My people, we are not like you. We are lichens. Werewolves in your stories." The word hung in the air between them, ridiculous and terrifying and yet, somehow, feeling more true than anything she had ever heard. It was the missing piece. The one that made all the other impossible pieces, the growl, the speed, the eyes, his unnatural strength, click into a horrifying, perfect picture. "Werewolves," she repeated, the word feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. "Was a myth. A fairy tale. But standing here in the dark, with this man who was more than a man, it felt like the only possible truth. I am the alpha of my pack," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers, willing her to believe him. "The leader. I was in the city tracking a traitor, a member of my pack who was selling our secrets, endangering us all. I needed a cover, a reason to be there that wouldn't raise suspicion. A human girlfriend, a fake one, was the perfect disguise. Your ad was a fortunate coincidence." The pieces kept falling into place. The professionalism. The vagueness about his job. The way he'd assessed her family like a threat. It had all been part of his mission. She had been part of his mission. The realization was a cold splash of water. "So I was just convenient?" she asked, a hint of bitterness seeping into her voice. "No," he said sharply, taking a step toward her. "Cassie, no. You were never just anything. You are," he struggled for the words, a man who clearly relied on action, not poetry. "You were a surprise. A beautiful, complicated surprise I never saw coming. What started as a job ended the moment I saw you in that yellow dress. What I feel for you, that is not fake. That has never been part of the mission." He was telling her he was a mythical creature, a leader of monsters, and that he had used her as a disguise. And yet, the raw sincerity in his voice when he spoke about his feelings for her was the most believable thing she had ever heard. "The man tonight," she prompted, her mind still reeling. "Probably one of the traitor's contacts. A human thug sent to scare me or to send a message. He picked the wrong night to try." A flicker of the fierce predator she'd seen on the street crossed his face. "He will not try again." Cassie wrapped her arms around herself, the cool mountain air suddenly feeling much colder. She looked out at the city, her old life, now looking so small and far away. She thought of the growl, the glowing eyes, the kiss. She thought of the way he made her feel, seen, protected, alive. He had given her the truth. It was terrifying. It was world-shattering. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever given her. She turned back to face him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But looking at him, standing tall and strong under the starlight, waiting for her judgment, another feeling rose to meet it. Not just trust. Not just attraction. It was something far more powerful and far more dangerous. It was acceptance. The word werewolf echoed in the vast, silent space between them, a seismic crack that had split Cassie's world cleanly in two. There was before, a life of quiet routine and understandable rules, and there was now, standing on a mountain under a blanket of stars with a man who was also a wolf. The truth was so enormous, so fundamentally bizarre, that her mind couldn't fully grasp it. It was like trying to hold the ocean in her hands. She just stood there, shivering slightly in the cool air, staring at Rafe as if seeing him for the very first time. He didn't move. He didn't try to explain further or soften the blow. He just let the truth hang there, raw and undeniable, allowing her the space to process it. His entire being was braced for her reaction, for the scream, the rejection, the flight he clearly expected. The pain of that expectation was etched into the lines of his face. Cassie's thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind. Werewolves. Lichens. Alpha. Each term was a key unlocking a new door of understanding, each door opening onto a reality more terrifying and incredible than the last. The growl in her living room. The golden glow in the dark. The primal force that had made an armed man flee in sheer terror. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. The myths and Hollywood horror movies faded into childish nonsense compared to the living, breathing reality of the man standing before her. Her gaze drifted from his tense face to the city lights far below. That was her world. A world of libraries and coffee shops and family barbecues. A world that had no place for ancient creatures of the moon. She could turn around. She could demand he take her back. She could run into that lit world and never look back, spending the rest of her life trying to convince herself she'd had a nervous breakdown. But as she looked at those distant, twinkling lights, she realized they no longer looked like safety. They looked like a cage. A small, predictable, and suddenly very lonely cage. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cool mountain air filling her lungs. She turned back to Rafe. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in her gut, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. Woven through the terror was a thread of something else, something bright and fierce and undeniable. Wonder. Okay, she said, her voice surprisingly steady in the vast quiet. Rafe's eyes widened a fraction. He had been prepared for anything but calm acceptance. Okay, he repeated, the word a cautious question. Okay, she said again, stronger this time. I believe you. The relief that washed over his features was so profound it was almost painful to witness. The tension in his shoulders eased just a little. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself as if afraid to spook her. You're not afraid? Cassie almost laughed, a short, breathy sound. I'm terrified, she admitted honestly. But I'm more afraid of you walking away and me spending the rest of my life wondering what this was. Who you are. The admission seemed to unlock something in him. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, but he didn't touch her. He just looked down at her, his stormy eyes searching hers. You are the bravest person I have ever met, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Before she could respond, a new sound cut through the night, not the natural sounds of the forest, but the distant, rising roar of a powerful engine, growing rapidly closer. Rafe's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid again, all his senses on high alert. The vulnerable man was gone, replaced in a heartbeat by the Alpha. A large, dark SUV, its headlights off, skidded to a halt at the entrance to the lookout, blocking the road. The door flew open and a man jumped out. He was almost as large as Rafe, with a muscular build and a fierce, worried expression. He moved with the same predatory grace. Rafe, the man called out, his voice urgent. His eyes flicked to Cassie, registering her presence with a quick, assessing glance that held no hostility, only intense concern. Brennan, Rafe said, his voice a low growl of acknowledgement. What is it? We found him, Brennan said, striding toward them. Jax. He's holed up in a warehouse near the docks, but he's not alone. He's got hired humans with him. Firearms. He knows you're here. He knows? Brennan's eyes darted to Cassie again, and the unspoken words hung in the air. He knows about her. Rafe's face darkened, a storm gathering in his eyes. The air around him seemed to crackle with a dangerous energy. He threatened the pack? Worse, Brennan said, his jaw tight. He bragged about it. Said he'd found a new way to hurt you. A weakness. His gaze landed on Cassie again, and this time the meaning was unmistakable. She was the weakness. The traitor knew about the human woman the Alpha was protecting. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, seeped into Cassie's bones. The man on the street hadn't been a random mugger. He'd been a scout. A warning. And she had been the target. Rafe turned to her. The look on his face was one of fierce, terrifying protectiveness, but beneath it she saw a flicker of something she'd never seen in him before, fear. Cassie, he said, his voice deadly serious. This man Jax, he's dangerous. And he knows about you now. He'll see you as a way to get to me. The city is no longer safe for you. The reality of the situation crashed down on her. This wasn't a fantasy. This was a life-and-death struggle, and she had inadvertently stepped into the middle of it. Her apartment, her job, her quiet life, they were all compromised. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice small. "There's only one place you'll be truly safe," Rafe said. "My territory. My pack's lands. It's remote. He wouldn't dare attack us there. My people can protect you in a way I can't here." Go with him? Leave her life behind? The thought was staggering. But the alternative, staying here, waiting for that man or someone like him to find her again, was unthinkable. Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "Alpha, we need to move. Now. If he knows we found his location, he'll scatter, or worse, he might launch an attack preemptively." Rafe's eyes never left Cassie's. He was giving her a choice. He was offering her protection, but it meant stepping fully into his world, a world she had only just learned existed. It meant trusting him completely. She thought of the kiss on the street, a moment of pure, unguarded feeling amidst the chaos. She thought of the way he'd told her the truth, risking her rejection and his own heart. She thought of the cold fear in the alley and the solid safety of his arms. She looked from Rafe's anxious, determined face to Brennan's worried one. These weren't monsters. They were men. Men with a secret, men in danger, and they were offering her sanctuary. The decision wasn't difficult. The fear of the unknown was far less than the fear of what she now knew was hunting in the known. She reached out and took Rafe's hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and certain. "Okay," she said for the third time that night, the word now a vow. "Take me with you." The journey was a blur of motion and surreal stillness. Brennan drove the SUV with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors, while Rafe sat in the back with Cassie, his body a tense, protective wall between her and the windows. They didn't speak. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rush of wind as they left the city lights behind and plunged into a deeper, more ancient darkness. Cassie watched the world change outside her window. The neat, predictable grid of suburban streets gave way to winding country roads, which then surrendered to narrow, rough tracks that climbed ever higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and cooler, scented powerfully of pine, damp earth, and something else, something wild and untamed that she had no name for. The further they went, the more the human world felt like a distant dream. After what felt like hours, Brennan slowed the vehicle to a crawl. They hadn't passed another car or seen a single house for miles. To Cassie, it looked like they were driving into the heart of an untouched wilderness. But then Rafe leaned forward. "There," he said, pointing to what appeared to be nothing more than a dense thicket of trees and rock off the side of the road. Brennan nodded and turned the wheel. The SUV bumped off the road and onto a path so cleverly concealed it was invisible until you were right upon it. They drove for another 10 minutes through a tunnel of overhanging branches before the trees suddenly opened up. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a village of log cabins as she'd vaguely imagined. It was a settlement, but one that seemed to have grown organically from the forest itself. The buildings were crafted from stone and massive, polished logs, with living roofs of grass and wildflowers. They were nestled amongst the towering pines, connected by winding flagstone paths. Soft, golden light glowed from windows, and the air was filled with the gentle sound of a nearby rushing river and the crackle of cooking fires. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a hidden world of powerful, quiet harmony. But it was the people who truly made Cassie's heart hammer against her ribs. As the SUV came to a stop in a central clearing, figures emerged from the buildings and from the shadows of the trees. Men and women, all possessing a similar aura of contained strength and grace. They were all strikingly healthy and athletic, moving with a predator's silent ease. Their eyes, in the dim light, seemed to hold a peculiar watchful sharpness. They were all looking at the vehicle, their expressions a mix of curiosity, respect, and wariness. This was the pack. Brennan got out first and the crowd parted for him slightly. He gave a short, sharp nod to a few of them. Then Rafe opened his door and stepped out. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous and electric. Where there had been low murmurs and casual watchfulness, there was now a palpable silence of deep respect. Every back straightened. Every head inclined just slightly. It wasn't a gesture of fear, it was one of acknowledgement, of loyalty. They were looking at their alpha. Rafe turned and offered his hand to Cassie. Her palms were sweating. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hand in his and let him help her out of the car. The moment her feet touched the ground, 100 intense gazes locked onto her. The silence became heavy, oppressive. She felt like a single fragile rabbit that had just wandered into a den of wolves. She instinctively moved closer to Rafe, her shoulder brushing against his arm. His presence was the only familiar thing in this strange, beautiful, and terrifying new world. Pack. Rafe's voice rang out, clear and strong, carrying an authority she had never heard in it before. It was the voice of a leader, a king in his court. This is Cassie. She is under my protection. She is a guest here. You will treat her with the respect you would show me. His words were a command, and the pack responded immediately. The tension broke. The wariness in many of the eyes softened into cautious curiosity. A few even offered small, tentative smiles. But Cassie could still feel the weight of their assessment. She was an outsider. A human. And she was clearly important to their alpha. It was a combination that bred both respect and suspicion. Rafe didn't give them long to stare. With a final, sweeping glance that seemed to communicate a dozen unspoken orders, he placed his hand on the small of Cassie's back and guided her away from the clearing and down one of the flagstone paths. He led her to one of the largest structures, a magnificent lodge built around the base of a gigantic redwood tree. Inside, it was warm and spacious, furnished with comfortable-looking leather chairs and thick rugs made of animal pelts. The air smelled of wood smoke and something spicy. "This is my home," Rafe said, his voice dropping back to its normal, quieter rumble now that they were alone. "You'll be safe here." He showed her to a room that took her breath away. It had a large, comfortable bed piled with furs and blankets, and one entire wall was open to a private wooden deck that overlooked a stunning vista of moonlit mountains and a deep, dark forest valley. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. "Try to rest," he said, lingering in the doorway. "I have to speak with my beta and the elders. There are things we need to discuss." The grim set of his jaw told her exactly what those discussions would be about. Jax. After he left, Cassie stood on the deck, wrapped in a blanket she'd taken from the bed, and looked out at the incredible view. The sheer scale and wildness of it was overwhelming. This was his world. These mountains, this forest, this pack. This was who he was. The man she'd met in the city was just a sliver of his whole self. Later, as dusk began to truly settle, Rafe returned. He had changed into simpler, more comfortable clothes and carried a tray with a steaming bowl of stew and a chunk of crusty bread. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, setting it down on a small table on the deck. They ate together as the stars began to pepper the vast, dark sky. He pointed out constellations, telling her the names his pack had for them, stories that were different from the ones she knew. He was different here. More relaxed in his own skin, more at peace. The constant tension he carried in the city was gone, replaced by a calm, grounded certainty. He told her about the pack, about their traditions, their connection to the land. He spoke of the responsibility of being alpha, the weight of protecting every single life under his care. He wasn't just a leader, he was the heart of the community, the final judge, the unwavering protector. The complexity of his life, the depth of his duty began to dawn on her, making her feel both incredibly humble and deeply privileged that he had let her into it. As the moon rose, full and brilliant, bathing the world in silver light, he fell silent. He was watching her, his gray eyes soft in the moonlight. "This is a lot," he said quietly. "I know it is. This world, it can be intense." Cassie looked from his face to the majestic, wild landscape and back again. The fear was still there, a quiet hum in the background. But it was being steadily replaced by a dawning sense of awe. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a revelation. "It's intense," she agreed, her voice soft. "But it's also the most real thing I've ever seen." She offered him a small, genuine smile. "It's you." The words hung in the air between them, a simple acknowledgement of the profound truth she had discovered. The fake boyfriend was gone. The mysterious stranger was gone. In his place was Rafe the Alpha. A man of two worlds who had chosen to share the truest one with her. He didn't reply with words. He just reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. The touch was a promise, a connection that spanned the impossible gap between their worlds. Under the watchful eyes of the moon and the mountains, surrounded by the silent, powerful presence of the pack, Cassie knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same again. And for the first time, that thought didn't terrify her. It filled her with a wild, hopeful wonder. The days that followed were a strange and beautiful dream. Cassie settled into a rhythm in the pack territory, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the subtle, powerful pulse of the community around her. Rafe was often busy, pulled away by his duties as alpha, meetings with his beta, Brennan, and the pack elders, patrols of the vast territory's borders. But when he was with her, he was fully present, showing her his world with a quiet pride. He showed her the roaring waterfall that was the pack's water source, the hidden meadows filled with wildflowers, the sacred clearing where they held their ceremonies under the moon. She met more of the pack. An older woman named Alara, a respected elder who taught her about the medicinal herbs that grew in the forest. A young, fierce warrior named Kalen, who was fiercely loyal to Rafe and who, after initial suspicion, began to treat Cassie with a protective, almost brotherly respect. She was slowly, tentatively being accepted. But the peace was a thin veneer. Everyone was on edge. The threat of Jax was a dark cloud hanging over the mountain. Patrols were doubled. Sentries were always watching. The pack was a coiled spring, waiting for the attack they all knew was coming. Cassie could feel it in the air, a constant, low hum of tension beneath the surface calm. Rafe tried to shield her from the worst of it, but she saw the worry in his eyes, the way he would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence, his head tilting as he listened to something on the wind that she could not hear. The man who was so calm and certain in his own territory was haunted by the danger he had brought to her doorstep. One afternoon they were walking near the eastern ridge, the most remote part of the territory. Rafe was quieter than usual, his gaze constantly scanning the tree line. "He's out there," Rafe said finally, his voice a low growl that was more wolf than man. "I can smell his cowardice on the wind. He's circling, waiting for a weakness." "We're safe here though," Cassie said, trying to sound confident, more for her own benefit than his. "The pack is strong. He wouldn't be stupid enough to attack you here on your own land." Rafe stopped walking and turned to her, his expression grim. "A cornered animal is always at its most dangerous. And Jax, he's not just an animal. He's cunning. And he hates me. He wants to take from me what I took from him." "What did you take?" Cassie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "His position. His honor. He was my beta before Brennan. My second in command. My brother." The pain in Rafe's voice was raw. "He betrayed that. He was selling our secrets, endangering our young. I had no choice but to challenge him and cast him out." His hatred festered. "Now he doesn't just want to lead, he wants to destroy everything I've built. And he sees you as the perfect tool to do it." The confession chilled her to the bone. This wasn't a simple fight. It was a vendetta. And she was a central piece in it. As if summoned by their conversation, a sharp, piercing howl ripped through the peaceful afternoon air. It was not the communicative howl of the pack she'd grown used to hearing. This was a sound of challenge. Of attack. Rafe's body went rigid. His eyes flashed that terrifying, brilliant gold for a split second before he shuttered them closed, his face a mask of fury and dread. "No," he breathed. "Not here. He's drawing us out. It's a trap." Another howl answered, closer this time, followed by the sounds of shouting and snarling from the direction of the main settlement. "The children's den," Rafe snarled, already transforming from the man she loved into the ruthless alpha. "He's going for the pups. To draw the warriors away from the heart of the village." His eyes locked onto Cassie's, filled with a terrifying conflict. His duty to his pack warred with his need to protect her. "Go." Cassie urged him, pushing at his arm. "Rafe, go. They need you." "I can't leave you alone," he roared, the sound echoing through the trees. "I'll hide. I'll run back to the lodge. Just go." The sound of fighting intensified. Rafe let out a roar of pure frustration that seemed to shake the very leaves on the trees. "Stay hidden. Run. Now." With one last agonized look at her, he turned and exploded into motion, moving through the trees with a speed that was barely human. Cassie didn't run toward the lodge. She knew that's what they would expect. Instead, she scrambled up a rocky outcrop, squeezing into a narrow crevice that was hidden by thick ferns. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt sick. She could hear it all, the snarls, the shouts, the terrible sounds of conflict. She pressed her hands over her ears, trembling, praying for Rafe's safety, for the pack's safety. The sounds of the main battle seemed to be moving, drawing away. Rafe's plan was working. The pack was driving the attackers back. A fragile hope began to bloom in her chest. It was then that she heard it. The soft crunch of a footstep on dry leaves, far too close. She held her breath, shrinking deeper into the crevice. A face appeared between the ferns. It was a man with cold, cruel eyes and a vicious smile. It was Jax. He wasn't where the fighting was. He had slipped through. He had found her. Well, he sneered, his voice a oily slide. The alpha's little pet. The weakness he was foolish enough to wear on his sleeve. He reached into the crevice, his fingers grabbing for her. Pure, adrenalized terror gave Cassie strength she didn't know she possessed. She scrambled backward out of the other side of the rock formation and ran. She didn't have a plan. She just ran, branches whipping at her face and arms, her breath sobbing in her lungs. Jax was faster. He was on her in seconds, his hand closing on her arm, yanking her back with brutal force. She stumbled, falling to the ground. He loomed over her, his eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. "This is going to break him," Jax whispered, his smile full of malice. "Knowing I took you. It will be a wound that never heals." He reached for her again. And in that moment, Cassie's fear crystallized into a sharp, clear point of defiance. She would not be his weapon. She would not be Rafe's weakness. She scrambled backward, her hand closing around a thick, heavy branch. As Jax lunged, she swung it with all her might, not at him, but at a loose pile of rocks stacked precariously on the ledge above them. The branch connected. The rocks shifted, then gave way, tumbling down in a small avalanche directly onto Jax. It wasn't enough to hurt him seriously, but it was enough to surprise him, to make him stumble back with a furious snarl. The distraction was all that was needed. A blur of black fur and immense power shot from the trees. Rafe. But it wasn't Rafe the man. It was the wolf. He was enormous, larger than any wolf had a right to be, a creature of muscle, fur, and fury. His lips were pulled back from teeth that looked like daggers, and a deep, continuous growl rumbled from his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. He hit Jax with the force of a freight train, knocking him away from Cassie. The two wolves became a whirlwind of snapping jaws, tearing claws, and savage snarls. It was the most terrifying and awe-inspiring thing Cassie had ever witnessed. It was raw nature, a battle for dominance and survival. She could only watch, frozen, as they fought. Rafe was bigger, stronger, driven by a righteous fury. Jax was quicker, more vicious, fighting with dirty tricks born of hatred. They were a matched pair, a tragic mirror of the brothers they had once been. But Rafe had something Jax did not. He had something to truly fight for. With a powerful lunge, Rafe got his jaws around Jax's throat. It was a killing blow held back by a thread. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jax went limp beneath him, whining in submission, his eyes wide with the shock of defeat. Rafe held him there for a long, tense moment, his own chest heaving, his golden eyes blazing with the need for vengeance. Cassie saw the struggle on his fierce, woven face, the alpha's right to execute a traitor warring with the memory of the brother he had once loved. Finally, with a sound of disgust, Rafe released him. He took a step back, shifting in a blur of light and motion back into his human form. He stood over Jax, naked and powerful, his body marked with bleeding scratches. "Leave," Rafe commanded, his voice a hoarse, guttural sound. "If I ever see your face near my territory or my mate again, I will not stay my hand. Your life is forfeit. Now run." Jax, still in his wolf form, scrambled to his feet. He gave one last hate-filled look at Cassie, then turned and fled into the forest, defeated and humiliated. The moment he was gone, the fierce energy seemed to drain from Rafe. He stumbled slightly, and then he was on his knees beside Cassie, his hands frantically checking her for injuries, his human eyes filled with a terror that far surpassed any he'd shown in the fight. "Cassie? Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" His voice was ragged with fear. She could only shake her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers trembling. "I'm okay," she whispered. "You came. You saved me." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, but she never wanted him to let go. Around them, the rest of the pack began to emerge from the trees, having secured the territory. They saw their alpha, kneeling in the dirt, holding the human woman as if she were the most precious thing in the world. They saw the defeated traitor gone. And they saw her, not as a weakness, but as the reason their alpha had fought with such ferocious love. The suspicion in their eyes was gone, replaced by a new, profound respect. She had not cowered. She had fought back. She had helped protect their pack. Rafe pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the quiet aftermath. "You are not my weakness, Cassie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my strength." And in that moment, surrounded by the pack that was now her own, Cassie knew it was true. She wasn't a visitor in his world anymore. She was a part of it. She was his. The days following the battle were a time of healing and profound change. The pack territory, once humming with a tense, waiting energy, now thrummed with a new unified purpose. The threat of Jax was gone, his bitter presence erased from their borders, and a collective sigh of relief seemed to move through the ancient trees themselves. The wounds, both physical and emotional, began to slowly knit themselves back together. Cassie found herself no longer on the outskirts, a curious human guest to be cautiously observed. The story of her defiance, The branch, the rocks, her calm under pressure, had spread through the pack like wildfire. She was no longer just the alpha's human. She was the human who had stood her ground. The human who had helped protect their home. The looks she received now were different. They held warmth, respect, and a sense of belonging. Ilara brought her special salves for her scratches. Kaelin taught her how to properly sharpen a knife, just in case. She was being woven into the fabric of the pack, one thread at a time. Rafe too was different. The constant, underlying tension that had always been a part of him, the weight of the secret and the hunt, had finally lifted. He was lighter, more present. The ghost of his former brother's betrayal, while still a sad memory, no longer held power over him. He had faced it, conquered it, and chosen mercy. And in doing so he had found a new, unshakable strength. One evening as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the entire pack gathered in the central clearing. A great fire was lit in the central pit, its flames dancing and crackling, sending sparks spiraling up towards the emerging stars. There was a feeling of ceremony in the air, a quiet, powerful anticipation. Cassie stood near the edge of the crowd, watching as families gathered, their faces soft and happy in the firelight. Rafe emerged from his lodge. He was dressed simply, but he carried himself with the innate authority that was as natural to him as breathing. The crowd parted for him, a sea of respectful faces. But he wasn't looking at them. His stormy gray eyes, reflecting the fire's glow, were fixed only on Cassie. He walked directly to her, and the entire pack fell into a hushed silence, every eye upon them. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the pines. He stopped before her, and for a moment he just looked at her, his expression so full of love and awe that it made her heart ache. Then he took both of her hands in his. His grip was warm and sure. "Cassie," he began, his voice strong and clear, carrying to every member of his pack. He was speaking to her, but he was also making a declaration to his people. "When I came into your world I was lost. I was hunting a ghost, wearing a disguise, and I thought I had everything figured out. I thought strength was about power and control. And then I met you." He paused, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "You showed me a different kind of strength. The strength of kindness. The courage it takes to be vulnerable. The power of trust. You saw the monster in me and instead of running you stayed. You saw the man beneath the alpha and you loved him." Tears welled in Cassie's eyes, but she didn't look away. She held his gaze, drinking in every word. "I hired a fake girlfriend," he continued, a small rueful smile touching his lips. "But fate, or the moon, or something much wiser than me sent me my real mate. My one true love. You are brave, you are kind, and you are strong. You have the heart of a wolf, and you have claimed mine completely." He slowly lowered himself to one knee before her. The collective intake of breath from the pack was a soft, rustling sound. A traditional alpha did not kneel. But Rafe was breaking tradition for her. He was showing his pack and her that his love for her was a partnership of equals. "This life, my life, it is wild and it is unpredictable. It is dangerous and it is demanding. But it is also beautiful and loyal, and full of a love deeper than any ocean." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Cassie, will you share it with me? Not as my guest. Not as my human. But as my partner. My equal. My Luna. Will you stay by my side in this world and every world forever?" The word Luna hung in the air. The moon. The partner to the alpha. The heart to his strength. It was the highest honor he could bestow. Cassie looked at the man kneeling before her. She saw the fierce warrior who had fought a monster for her. She saw the compassionate leader who cared for his people. She saw the vulnerable man who had trusted her with his deepest secret. She saw her fake date, her protector, her love. Her journey had begun with a silly plan to silence her uncle, and it had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this family. There was no hesitation. There was only a perfect, certain peace. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying her answer to the entire pack. "My home is wherever you are. Human and wolf. Today, tomorrow, and forever. Yes." A roar of approval erupted from the pack, a sound of howls and cheers and joyful shouts that shook the very mountains. Rafe surged to his feet, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around, his laughter a rich, joyful sound she had never heard before. He kissed her then, not with the desperate fire of their first kiss, but with a deep, sweet, lasting promise that sealed their fate. When he finally set her down, the pack surged forward, not to crowd them but to surround them. They were smiling, reaching out to touch her arm, to offer their congratulations, to welcome her officially and completely into their fold. She was one of them. Under the vast, starry sky, surrounded by his pack, their pack, Rafe kept his arm around her, holding her close. The future was unwritten, and it would undoubtedly hold challenges. But they would face them together. The fake boyfriend was a forgotten memory. The real alpha had found his Luna. And their story, wild and beautiful and uniquely theirs, was only just beginning. And so, under the watchful eye of the moon, their new life began. A human heart and a wolf's soul forever intertwined. If you were captivated by Cassie and Rafe's extraordinary journey, from a desperate lie to a legendary love, there are countless more stories waiting to be discovered. To ensure you never miss a tale of fated mates, fierce protectors, and the magic that hides in the world just beside our own, subscribe to the channel. Your next adventure into the wild and wonderful awaits.